Welcome to this episode of the Fatty Acid Forum, where we dive into practical ideas on making more pounds of milk fat with Steve Martin, founder of DNMC Milk and nutritionist to dairies and heifer growers across the country and around the world. Listen in as Steve shares his insights into achieving more milk fat and his approach through balancing fatty acids in the ration.
Well, welcome to the Fatty Acid Forum, Steve Martin. I'm excited to spend this time with you today and digging into all things fat. And certainly fat and making more milk fat is super high on the priority list, as that's how our producers are getting paid. Such a heavy weight on milk fat, and certainly producers have responded to that with the average of the U.S. milking herd over 4% milk fat, which is amazing. But today I want to hear from you on, how you're helping your customers achieve these higher levels of milk fat, and maybe, let's start just at the very basics. Like, what are those key things that you really focus on with your clients to help make sure that they're capturing as much of this milk fat margin as they can?
Yeah, well, thanks for the opportunity to visit today. Before I hop in, I should probably say a word of thank you to Virtus, because I feel like not just me, but maybe the industry as a whole has been pushed along by your company in the area of fatty acid nutrition, and even down to the salespeople and your technical staff have pushed us to as consulting field nutritionists to really go to some new levels on how we formulate for fats and diets. And so I think it's a lot of good has come from that, and obviously butterfat levels in the industry seem to reach new highs every year, and so part of that's probably genetics in the animal, and a lot of it though is I think we're feeding cows better, and you and your team I think can take a lot of credit for that, because I think we're feeding cows better partially because of y'all's efforts and things like the Fatty Acid Forum. So very excited to be part of this. So you asked a question about just kind of the generals on thinking about butterfat for our clients, and knowing that is such a big driver on just overall farm income and income over feed costs and returns. And most of the places that we feed cows, it's butterfat and protein together that drive the milk price. And I think a lot of our cows are close to cheese plants and what you traditionally call cheese markets. But even if you're right next to a cheese plant, the butter price has really been a big part of your milk check in recent years. But other places we feed cows in the country where milk protein is not part of the pricing formula, and butterfat is obviously the key importance there. So I look at butterfat, the techniques of butterfat, maybe group them into a couple of different areas. One of the things that we've known for 30 years, it's things that I would have learned early on in my nutrition career, or even at school, about feeding forage, high levels of forage, and not too much grain, and things like adding buffers and bicarb and things to kind of help just butterfat in general. But I think that's the old news right now. Now we don't need to quit doing those things, but I think that obviously some things that we'll talk about in more detail, I think are going to really be the meat of what we're going to really challenge producers and nutritionists to really make sure we're kind of on the cutting edge of these things. And I do want to tip my hat, and I said it already, I'll say it again, to the genetic side of our industry. I mean, we have a different cow than we did when I started in this business 30 years ago. And we have a cow that is kind of waiting to help us feed her right to really make some good butter fat. So I think we have a great opportunity to really grow the income for our clients.
Yeah, I think back to, maybe even just 5 years ago, as producers trying to make a decision between Holsteins and Jerseys, and the economics around that. And I don't think any of us could have fathomed the gains so quickly on milk fat, and no doubt genetics is certainly a part of that.
Yes.
So
yes.
As you talked about those basics of how much starch and how much forage, and kind of those, and the buffers, those basics, obviously you're way past the basics on what you're working with on your clients to achieve those next levels. It's much, butterfat is much more complicated than those basics. Can you explain, what you mean by that and what those next areas are that you're really digging into?
Yeah, so back in the old days, we would just think about a forage to concentrate ratio. So, and then we may have thought about starch, but we may not have calculated it right. We may have thought about starch as just something that wasn't fiber, or we may have just thought about ADF and NDF and make sure we have enough of those, as opposed to now we think about having enough of those, but not having too much starch as well. So all of this has to go back to just, in my view, what this animal, this awesome animal, is designed to do and what she was designed to eat. And it's not really the things that we're feeding her in a lot of cases. So, the ruminant species is really centered around acetic acid. And so that's the predominant method that animals are going to make milk and make milk fat and go forward. And so you take the animal, the diets that a wild ruminant or a beef cow would be eating, and just think about the volume of acetic acid that's coming out of those high forage diets. So we should be thankful for that in the dairy world, because that's the building blocks for butterfat. And so anything that we can do to increase acetic acid production is going to really, really help us get a head start before we start really getting into the details. So, instead of just looking at forage percent now, we look at details like NDF and the NDF digestibility. We want to make sure that the fiber that we have in rations is not just good for keeping cows healthy and ruminating and such, but also it has digestibility so that it can actually be fermented in the rumen and create the volatile fatty acids, particularly acetic acid, that we need for the building blocks of butterfat. So, we know that if we have very undigestible forages in a ration, we're going to struggle with that area. We know if we have too much starch in a ration, that we're going to have a negative influence on the fiber digesters that are going to create that acetic acid. So really and truly, a fine-tuned rumen that just obeys all the rules is really what's going to give us the head start on just making, just maybe a safe or basic level of butterfat before we even do anything fancy. And then I want to make one more comment on the fiber and forage side, is that this all can't be done in the model. So we have to get out there and we have to look at manure. We have to measure forage length. And in our group, we do a lot of work with the Penn State particle separator shaker box. And the goal there is that we need these cows chewing cud to make good butterfat. And so we can make it look perfect on paper and have all the numbers just right. But if we have the ration that's too long and sortable, then we're not going to get the actual ration consumed that we hope. And if it's overly processed and such, we're just going to have a rumen situation that's not going to be advantageous for maximizing that butterfat synthesis. And so the shaker box is a great tool, and it's not a one size fits all. I think every dairy and every nutritionist kind of has their perfect sweet spot on that fits the way they feed, because the shaker box goals are different with different starch levels and different levels of digestible fiber and undigestible fiber and these things. So I would encourage the use of a shaker box just to make sure that the things that we have on paper are really going to work when they get inside the rumen.
Yep, no, that's great. And then with going back to those measurements that you're looking at on fiber, UNDF and the different, time periods for NDFD, do you have specific numbers you're really shooting for, you want to see, or maybe what those numbers are where you're kind of off the rails and need to figure out how to improve those?
Yeah. Well, so I think you could look at minimums of things and maximums of things. And so we'll talk about minimums on roughage. And, in the old days, we used to talk about a ration should be at least 40% roughage or 40% forage. It's like, okay, well, what are forages? And then we kind of, in areas where maybe forage was expensive or short supplies, then we kind of shift the word to roughage instead of forage, because it may end up being things like byproducts and cotton byproducts and beet pulp and almond hulls and things that really truly aren't a forage plant, but they are roughage. So we're trying to maybe better detail not only the laboratory measurements on these forages, but how digestible are they in the rumen. So we need to make sure in the fiber standpoint that we have structural fiber I mean, I call it like rebar in the rumen. And so these are things that hold the rumen together. They're like the traffic cop of the rumen. They're going to signal to the animal and the movement of the muscular part of the rumen of how long this stuff stays in the rumen. And so we have to have enough physical fiber in there to make sure that is done correctly. But at the same time, we need to have forages that have good NDF digestibility so that we can create that acetic acid. So what we really want in these diets is we really want enough physical lignin and cellulose to hold the rumen together, but we need a lot of hemicellulose that is unencumbered by lignin so that we can really create that good NDF digestibility. So I think those are on the fiber side is we talk about having a minimum amount of say UNDF to keep cows healthy. And then we start tracking pounds of digestible NDF at 30 hours. And that's kind of a new number for us, but it tends to reflect the kind of those building block precursors for butterfat. But then all the while you're doing that, you have to keep a lid or a cap on the starch and starches and sugars together, because those things are going to counteract some of the hemicellulose digestibility. So I find as we feed cows in different parts of the country, it's amazing the different appetites for starch levels that people are willing to feed. And I think it's probably mostly described by things that are real, like the species of the corn, the speed of the starch, whether it's flake corn or ground corn, whether it's an area that tends to put up dry corn silage versus wet corn silage. So yeah, some people might feel like 25% starch is where they start tapping the brakes, and other people would think that's crazy. We can do 31% all day long. And so I think you need to figure out what that number is for a particular dairy, and maybe a particular geography that tends to feed the same, and then just really put a lid. Sometime in my ration formulation stuff, I'll just put a maximum starch level just to make sure that I don't accidentally go too high, because that will cause a lot of trouble in not just hurting butterfat, but obviously negative on cow health as well. Yeah.
Right. All right. So let's jump into, the second area of fine tuning, that area of fatty acids, and, as you've worked with, fatty acids in the diet, what are those key areas or key fatty acids that are really helping and then also hindering milk fat production?
Yeah. Yeah, so this we could talk hours about, obviously, and I know you live it 24/7 in your world. So there again, I love to look back over the history of 30 years of doing this. And I remember early on in my career, we were learning in a feed company, set up how to feed tallow to animals, and how to carefully do that in a way to increase energy density. And I remember on one of those early training sessions, it's like, you can add this fat, but if you do it, you have to go up 3 or 4 points in forage, or you're going to get in trouble. We just knew those basic rules. And so now you look back in that and you kind of say, oh, I kind of know what we were talking about there. But in those days, it was kind of crude fat and ether extract and stuff. And so just like protein has gone from, protein to say crude protein, to then digestible and soluble and RDP and UIP, and then pushing it into the amino acids. And now we're in a very exciting area in amino acid nutrition, where it's like, hey, it's not all about lysine and methionine. It's about all the essential amino acids. And that's really laid out well in the NASEM that recently was published. And so, we did the same thing in the carbohydrate side. I think if you go back to the, back to school, it was proximate analysis stuff, and you had, I think, nitrogen-free extract was kind of the way we kind of figured soluble carbohydrates or available carbohydrates kind of by difference. And now we're, not only are we differentiating between starch and sugars, we're differentiating types of sugars and speeds of starch and gelatinization and not. So we're really digging down into the details, and I think that now we've accomplished that with fatty acids. So it wasn't very many years ago that we looked at crude fat as kind of a way to enhance energy in the ration for milk production. And maybe we thought about it for a little bit for milk, but maybe we thought a lot about it for body condition, and thereby creating good reproductive success for high milking cows. So I remember the first thing that would have been probably back around 2000, we started hearing stuff about linoleic acid, and in that time maybe we just thought about it as vegetable oils. So I remember it started to get the kind of the word around the industry. It's like, yeah, these vegetable oils are problematic, and they have some negative impacts maybe on fiber digestibility. And I remember one specific mentor of mine where they did some research where they post-ruminally put corn oil in dairy cows, and with obviously post-ruminally no impact at all on anything related to acetic acid production. But he said, I can turn off milk fat synthesis by putting this corn oil in the duodenum of a dairy cow. And it's like, man, that's crazy. What's going on there? And I think that was around 2000, maybe even the late 90s. And so, we've known for a long time to be careful with vegetable oil. I don't know when I went from calling it veg oil to linoleic acid, and now I think maybe what rolls off my tongue is 18-2 fatty acids. And right. I think the scientists have done a disservice for those of us in the field when we talk about these fatty acids in terms of carbon length and double bonds, and then we also have names for some of them, not names for all of them, and some of them are saturated, not saturated, and you got the carbon length and linolate, linolenic, steric. It begins to, when you start learning this, it's really a lot. And I remember a few years ago just thinking, this is overwhelming me. I need to take some time to figure all this out. And so one of the things that I've done in my world is I've tried to, like in my ration software, I've tried to name things by their carbon length and their kind of the nomenclature of, say, 18-2 linoleic acid and 16-0 palmitic acid, things like that, just to be able to make sure that if, as I'm looking at it or somebody else is looking at it, we have the nomenclature down. But I should back up and say one thing that I really feel strongly about with all of these nutrients that we've talked about so far today is that I am a believer and a follower of optimization of rations. So I'm a linear programming formulator. I won't follow a least cost formula over the edge of a cliff. Obviously, I know the things that it'll tell me at times it's crazy, and I know at times you can't ever get it to solve, and you just have to go get a cup of coffee and come back to it and figure it out later. But I am a believer in using linear optimization to build diets. The computer's always smarter than me, with some bounds, of course. So I can apply that obviously in the amino acid area by putting sources of lysine and methionine in a diet, and then telling the model kind of what numbers I want to meet on lysine and methionine and maybe some of the other essential amino acids. And I can do the same thing with fatty acids. I can go in there, and what I've been doing probably most notably for, I don't know, the last several years is putting a maximum on 18-2 fatty acids and then putting a minimum on 16-0. And that's the place to start. And so whether I use the optimizer to get me there or whether I use just, a kind of a back and forth moving things around to get those numbers right, I really know what I want those to be. And I think that there's and every dairies don't have the same normal, right? And so I don't know if the difference from dairy A to dairy B is that we really don't know exactly where we are on some of these numbers, but the absolute value of some numbers we're working with from dairy to dairy or forage lab to forage lab. But I do know the directions to move things, and I have some sense of the meaningfulness of clicks on the knob. So like if I go to a dairy and they have whether you're talking about grams of ruffle or I like to look at percent 18-2 fatty acids. If I go to a dairy like that and they're feeding a little bit of some cheaper byproducts that may be carrying some vegetable oil in them, I will look, and if butterfat's problematic, I will look at where those 18-2 fall in from a percent standpoint. And then I'll go and I'll lower it some, like a meaningful amount to lower it. And I'll say, okay, solve with less of this. And then you go feed that and you see what you accomplish from the standpoint of butterfat. But you got to remember those 18-2 fatty acids, even though they're, they have a negative impact on milk fat synthesis, but they do provide some energy, right? So you have to make sure, and I'm still a believer in NEL. I know some people don't really formulate on NEL, but I'll go in there and put a minimum on NEL. I don't put minimums on fat as much anymore. These fats have different digestibilities. They have, if you look at tallow versus a calcium salt versus a stearic acid product, they all have their own NEL, and depends on the digestibility of the fats that are in there. And so I will let the computer sort that out for me. Now, there are some tricky things to think about, and I guess the thing through my career that I saw kill butterfat most notably and quickly and demonstrably was really talks a lot about this topic, and it was a long time ago, but there was it circles around the topic of cottonseed, which we can talk about cottonseed. Obviously, cottonseed is a product that has maybe approaching 20% fat in it, so it certainly fits in this conversation. But it's the wrong kind of fat. It's the 18-2 fatty acids. So I think back before we knew a lot about some of these principles, there were some companies that made some cottonseed replacer products, and they used any kind of fat they could find, and soap stock, corn oil, soybean oil, whatever, and they put some soy hulls and some roughage in there with it. It's like, had 20% protein, 20% fiber, and 20% fat. And I'm telling you, we were like that researcher that told me that he put the linoleic acid in the duodenum and killed the butterfat. I mean, we did it almost as quick with that product. So I always keep that in my mind, because that when you see something that's that dramatic, it's like, yeah, this stuff really is true. So there was a study, I think it was a meta-analysis, and maybe, I don't know if it was a poster or an abstract, maybe 5 or 6 years ago at ADSA by Diaz that basically looked across journal data, peer-reviewed data, and looking at the relationship of 18-2 fatty acid intake and butterfat from a percent standpoint and yield standpoint. And what surprised me about that study was that I would have thought there was a free zone that you could get away with some amount of 18-2 fatty acids before it started to overwhelm the rumen. And I still, in my gut, I still feel like that seems like that should be true based off experience and logic, but the data would suggest otherwise. The data would show that from the first few grams of 18-2 fatty acids that you have a linear reduction in milk fat synthesis. So that's pretty compelling to me. The model that I use has a milk fat depression index type calculator in it, and if I start feeding too much cheap distillers, or distillers gets all the bad press, but it's only one of a bunch of things that have 18-2 fatty acids in them, from wet brewer's grain to hominy, and even some of the I'll probably get some emails about this, but even some of the bypass soybean meal products that have soybean oil left in them, there's a fair amount of linoleic acid in some of that. And so I think there's some pretty good stories around how that may be less of a problem than you might think. But 18-2 fatty acids, I'll tell the computer how much I can stand, and then let the computer, the linear program, decide where to use them and where to put them.
Yeah, and I think, as you're kind of talking through, all the places that 18-2 are in the diet, it's hard. It's probably very difficult to keep that number in check, because anything corn related is roughly 50% 18-2, and so on top of high corn silage diet, even though the fatty acid levels in corn silage are not very high, like 3%, still, if you're feeding a lot of tons of that, it can those grams can add up very quickly. And I've seen where it's isn't necessarily a change in the fat supplement or change in some of the other ingredients, but just the that change in the pile, going into a different section in the pile, and that's the culprit, that made milk fat go down. So well,
if you look at some of the alfalfa based diets compared to the corn silage based diets and then the wheatless based diets, I think that you're going to have the highest 18-2s in the corn silage diets, and especially if you're pairing that with you're feeding 20 pounds of corn silage and another 5 or 6 pounds of ground corn or flake corn. It's a lot, and it's very available. It's in a wet product. It's ready to rock and roll when it gets in the rumen. So we should go back to cottonseed and to look at the other end of the spectrum on that is that there's data that there's old historic data that shows cottonseed having a positive impact on butterfat, and how can that be since it's 18-2 fatty acids? Well, don't forget that the cottonseed is fat, and cottonseed is very tightly held within the cottonseed hull, and even within that, it's inside of a. If you ever open up a cottonseed, look at that meat in there. It's a fairly viscous type, slippery product. It's not a product that's going to have a lot of room and retention time, perhaps, if it falls out of that shell. And so I do think that we see cottonseeds in the manure. It's something we look for in our manure screens, and so I think that's also that and maybe even some roasted soybeans. I think sometimes you get away with some of that because the fat digestibility just isn't as high as you would hope it was, and certainly not as high as it was in that cottonseed replacer product that I fed that hurt the butter fat. So cottonseed. So back to the linoleic acid in maximum in a ration formulation program. If you're using cottonseed, you may have a higher threshold for where that becomes a problem. And so, and if you bring cottonseed into a ration and you've got that 18-2 maximum set, it won't pull the cottonseed at all. But if you say, okay, well, 18-2 from cottonseed is different than 18-2 from DDG, then you can feed some cottonseed. I always tell people that work for your company and other people in the fat selling businesses, like, cottonseed's not your enemy. There's no sense to go to war with cottonseed. Cottonseed's on the shaker box standpoint, it's a second shelf item that really has some very positive characteristics, and it can contribute some fatty acids, but it's not going to carry the weight. And most of our cottonseed feed rates nowadays are 2.5 pounds. It's not like in the old days where we fed 5 or 6 pounds of cottonseed.
Right.
The cotton plants grew really good around the lagoon because there was a lot of passage at those feed rates. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the other piece back to the 18-2, I mean, you're describing, like, is it in cottonseed where there's that, protection, physical structure that's protecting it, versus DDG where it's heat treated and virtually no protection on that 18-2 for those rumen bugs to get to. And, we've coined that term, naked fat or protected.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a whole scale. It's like, I don't know if your computer can dissect that quite as well. So it probably still needs your eagle eye on, like, where is it cutting back on the 18-2 to have the most impact, because if you can start with those items that that the bugs have no barrier to, if it's Pima cottonseed in there or bakery,
yes, absolutely,
or DDG, those types of ingredients where there's nothing slowing those rumen bugs down from getting to that 18-2.
Yeah, don't forget that wet brewer's grain falls in that same category. Like I say, distillers gets all the negative press, but the brewers, I mean, it may be a point or two in fat behind. But you just think any corn product that any grain product that you remove the majority of the starch, you're going to increase the concentration of the fats that are left there, and they're almost all 18-2 or just vegetable fat in general. And then people say, okay, well, why doesn't corn gluten have the fat that distillers does? And it's because in the wet corn milling process, they actually remove the part of the corn that has the majority of the fat in it. So yeah, corn gluten is less than half the fat content that distillers is, even though they're both corn byproducts. And the 18-2 though is the easy part to me. So I'm going to show you what I have in front of me that you can't see. And I use these all the time. Okay, so they come in this nice little packet with the little Velcro thing on it. And whoever your marketing person that did that, or whether it was you, whatever, this is something that these literally ride in my computer bag with me. And part of it is just because it's a challenge for me to there's a few details that I just need to get it out and look, okay, what's the fat that's in, wheat grazing again? And, just look through this list. And so I would just recommend that this needs to be at your fingertips, because at least it needs to be at mine. And, you could have sent it out as a PDF or an app on your iPhone or whatever, but literally having something that's a piece of paper that's in a little folder. So, when I come look at this and start, I think that where I look forward to going to the next level on some of this is just going to the to the next level on oleic as an example. I know oleic, the increase in oleic in rations can, improve the digestibility of the other fatty acids in the ration. So, think about what lignin is to fiber. Like oleic is like the opposite of that in fats. It's helping things get digested better instead of hurting them. And so, some of the blended fats that we have, that some products from your company that have different ratios of things, and even some larger dairies. It's not uncommon now in dairies for us to have a calcium salt type product along with a high palm product on the same farm. And so that's a situation where you have great flexibility to do what you want to do. And so I think I remember as well going back to the first time that I was introduced to the palm products, and it's like, this is a magical butterfat increaser. And I remember thinking, it's like, well, if the carbons go from that fat directly into the butterfat, like you say, then what happens to the carbons that we were using for body condition and reproduction and stuff like that? And so, I like to say that in carbohydrate nutrition and in fatty acid nutrition, you can only use that carbon once as it relates to milk production and you can't use it for body condition support and also support your butterfat. So as we've looked at the balancing of these different fatty acids, while we keep a lid on 18.2, there's a lot of more complicated work to be done. And I'll confess, I'm a student in that area. I have an idea how much palmitic acid I want to put in rations, and I think that there again it seems to be a different amount for each dairy. But it seems like I'll put minimums on palmitic acid at times to pull the calcium salt in or to pull the palm product in, and let the cost of each kind of determine from the linear programming which one's the best way to get where we want to go. But I've been encouraged by some people on your team and just other people in the industry that there's a couple of other ratios I need to put in my model to start watching, particularly related to oleic. So I don't know, you can maybe you be the teacher for a minute and teach me something.
There you go. Well, I think, certainly everybody's trying to figure out how much palmitic, how much oleic are in these diets, because the palmitic helps, as you said, goes directly to the mammary gland to make milk fat, and oleic helps with digestibility, kind of like a surfactant, if you're familiar with that term on the crop side, helping all the fatty acids at the small intestine to really improve digestibility, more of them to be absorbed. So that drives efficiency and just total energy for the cow to use for reproduction and milk and all those things. So both are important. And I think there's been some hard lessons learned out there with just going straight milk, straight palmitic, and then forgetting that the oleic is really important. That's we took care of the mammary gland with the palmitic, and then but the cow still needs more those fatty acids to be absorbed well, and to take care of all the other things that keep that milk production sustainable to the next lactation. So I think if you look at the research out of Michigan State, and the oleic digestibility, I mean, we've kind of concluded that, I mean, at an absolute minimum, there should be a third of a pound of a calcium salt in those diets. That's the absolute minimum. And we don't think there's a perfect ratio of palmitic to oleic on every single dairy, because there's palmitic and oleic in your base diet, and how much is there. And, I think we'll get to a point where we're accounting for what that is, and then what we're adding in, from a calcium salt or, higher palm prill. But the data, you can have, there's some research that would say you should be a little higher palmitic than oleic, and, and then, the base of the data, though, as we look at the comparisons, the higher palm prills ratios to a calcium salt, leave me thinking that balance is better, actually, because every time we push palmitic up, oleic goes down, rarely we're feeding a calcium salt and then we just add some palm prill on top. Usually we're taking something back and adding in the palm prill, and therefore oleic is going down at the same time. And so you're not always actually getting better ECM when you do that, because you're pulling back on digestibility. So it's, it's complicated, right? It's fatty acids, it's complicated, but, certainly we've learned a lot, and, the the spotlight that's on oleic right now, I think is really, really good as we're, shooting for
Right.
better efficiency. Can't
Yeah,
forget the other things.
So an example of where I go back to the show and tell and use your tools is, so I go to a meeting and I hear someone, all the conversation about oleic, and I go to this sheet right here that basically looks at calcium salts and palm and cottonseed and tallow and roasted beans. Okay, where is the oleic? Where is the opportunity? Now these things are loaded in my ration software, and I can go in there and I can put the levels and it'll pull them based on that. But it is helpful to know, where these key ingredients are, and then understanding on the basic calcium salt kind of what that ratio is, and knowing that there's times we may build that with some individual ingredients on a farm, but in most cases it's going to be, I mean, calcium salts are really are key in most all diets, and they have very high acceptance rate. And the question is how much do you feed? And one of the areas that I'm trying to learn about is whether it's in a snowstorm in Kansas that tends to be followed by a month of muddy, cloudy weather, or a hot summer in Florida or Central Texas. Is if I want to support body condition, for instance, as it relates to just getting cows through the heat stress or through the mud stress, and thinking particularly about reproduction, are there ways to maybe change the fatty acid balance a little bit to address specifically body condition support? And now the thing that probably pushes you back to calcium salt is there's almost certainly in heat stress, you would always be likely worried about butterfat as well when you're worried about that body condition loss. So it could be that you end up back at a traditional calcium salt. But I do think it's interesting to think about, are there times, particularly maybe in the winter, where where we lose body condition with weather stress and the cold and wet, that we maybe the calcium salt isn't the best thing to put body condition back on a cow. That's more of a question than a comment. I just think that that now we have the ability to look at them separately. Why not look at the specific need and where they're actually going to go from a metabolic standpoint, and build the diet the right way. And I mean, I don't know, who knows, maybe even a little splash of 18-2 might be the right answer to put body condition on cows in a minute. I don't know. And are we feeding the right amount of starch? Are we maximizing on starch to make sure maybe there's some room there? And I would make one comment I should go back to the starch piece on, is that the reason that some dairies tend to get away with maybe more distillers feeding or higher 18-2 levels is, we know that some of the bad realities that happen with 18-2s happen at lower rumen pHs. And so if you happen to be feeding like a high alfalfa diet and a high byproduct diet with a lot of NDF digestibility and maybe lower starch diet, maybe that diet has a little bit more room for the cheaper fat, and you can get away with more. So, every ingredient's made of nutrients, and every nutrient has a need, and just managing them as nutrients, not ingredients, is really the right way to probably build the best diet.
Yeah, that's well said. So as we're getting close to wrapping up, I wanted to bring it back to economics, since that's the goal. Being able to navigate these improvements in how we're feeding cows to put more money in the producer's pocket and keep cows healthy at the same time. Maybe talk a little bit on I have a little bit of my personal mission is to make sure that producers aren't making ration decisions around what that milk fat percent is, because nobody gets paid on a percent. We get paid on pounds of milk fat and pounds of protein, and that percent really isn't worth anything if it isn't attached to pounds. So, when we make these ration changes, to improve milk fat, the nice thing is milk fat changes quickly, and you get that immediate feedback. Within a few days, how that ration or the cows have responded to those ration changes. But talk to me about, I guess, the fallacy of just looking at milk fat percent, and what else you look at to really help make sure that you're making decisions based on all the things that need to be measured in those at those time points.
So there's been a lot of different methods to try to to solve the conundrum of what's the value of a pound of milk. Well, it depends on a lot of things, some of which are related to the market but most of which are related to, well, what kind of pound of milk, what kind of milk is in that pound of milk. And so, I think that most, the Florida dairies are a little bit different. Most of what I work with is, a true component pricing standpoint. So, we calculate an income over feed cost on a weekly basis for our clients. And so, and it changes, the price structure changes monthly, and we're kind of always a month behind because of the way the reporting is done. But, we should be able to pick up on as far as the economics, if we invest, like let's say we invest in a better fatty acid balance and we add, 12 cents per cow of feed cost, or 15 or whatever, 25, whatever it is, if we're tracking, the next week's probably going to be an investment week, right? You're not going to see something immediately. So you just don't look for anything the next week. But in the second and third week, you're going to show that increased cost. So immediately you invest, your cost went up 25 cents or 20, whatever it is. And then as you begin to build some butterfat, maybe in response to that change, then you're going to, then what we're going to calculate, we're going to look at, how many pounds of extra butterfat did we sell, whether the cows went up in milk and had the same butterfat, or whether they stayed the same in milk and had more butterfat percent, or whether they maybe actually went down in milk flow and had a higher butterfat percent. I mean, the point is, unless you're in a few places in the U.S., the consumers do not want your water, right? I mean, it's just
Right.
a freight cost. It is it's a problem for hauling. It's a problem for sustaining. It's just a problem. And so if we can find ways to concentrate milk from the diet and the genetics of the cow, then what a great win for the industry. So percent fat, is usually correlated with profitability, but there are some times, I'm thinking about times where maybe your milk you wish your pounds of milk was better. And I mean, this is like some of my clients say, well, nutritionists just love energy corrected milk because it's almost always goes up, and it makes you feel better about your rations and the success of your diets. It's like, well, yes, but I mean, that's also probably most closely associates to the way you get paid. So I think Greg Bethard's money corrected milk thing is a good approach. Energy corrected milk is a good approach. I mean, we do fat corrected milk in Florida because protein doesn't enter into the milk check. But you need to make sure that you're not only looking at the percentage of the components, but the pounds that you sell. And then if you really want to do a true income over feed cost, then not only do you need to know, what that weekly feed cost change is, it could be that you do something to the diet that causes them to eat a pound more feed. Okay, well, that's another 17 cents of cost just because they ate more feed. Or if you had, let's say your rate of passage was too high and your feed intakes were really a little bit high, and you fixed that by, feeding more roughage and really having a better rumen health diet, and you actually lost a couple pounds of intake without losing milk. Then you just saved like close to 40 cents of feed cost, and just talk about a win-win on feed conversion. And really, when I look at feed conversion, it's a biological feed conversion. You got pounds of intake, and then pounds of energy corrected milk would be the way I would do it. But the real ratio to me is the dollars of feed costs invested and the dollars of milk volume created. So if you invest money in the feed cost part by making the fatty acid amino acid balancing better, whatever it is you did, you bought better hay, it was cost more money, the return on that investment is really what, and maybe it's a return on the extra investment you could look at, like, did I make the right decision or not? But honestly, to me, it's a return on the whole investment. I just fed a cow $9 worth of feed today. How much milk income is she going to give me? And how can I do things to reduce that input cost? And how can I do things to increase that revenue? And one of the best ways to increase that revenue is to increase your milk fat synthesis via one of these many ways we've talked about, and then end up increasing your total gross income. So I need to before we're done, I need to say something real quick about milk fatty acid analysis. And so I don't know how much time you have for that.
Yep.
But so I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, a good friend named Michelle Baldwin started teaching me about milk fatty acids. and it's like, hey, I kind of get this, but what do you mean? What is this de novo stuff? And you know, this came out of Cornell and then it's through Penn State. Does it really matter to me in Texas? And so for a number of years, we've been using milk fatty acid analysis as a way to, we don't use it every day on every dairy, but we use it as a problem solving technique. If the normal things that we do to move butter fat aren't working, then we will go to the next level and try to figure out, based off the milk fatty acid analysis, basically there's 3 buckets of fat in milk, and the problem is and maybe this is the challenge for people. The middle bucket is kind of a big question mark because it contains parts of the other 2 buckets, and so it'd be really better if it wasn't like that. But we can use, so the de novo fatty acids are the ones that the cow is creating because she's a ruminant. Okay, so the de novo fatty acids are the things where you take wheat forage in Southwest Kansas and you turn it into butter. Okay, so that's de novo fatty acid synthesis. So that's what we need to do more of, because that fiber is the cheapest part of our ration. Okay, calcium salts and palm supplements and all these other things are very expensive, and we need to feed the right amount of those. But cellulose in a wheat plant in the Texas Panhandle is maybe one of the cheapest things you're going to feed, or a corn stalk. So how can we make more of that into butter fat? So this milk fatty acid analysis will allow you to say, okay, how are we doing in that? We kind of know Dr. Barbano and the guys at Cornell came up with these standards, and you can tell if you're like below average or above average on what that de novo number is. And so you can say, okay, do I have good forage digestibility? Am I picking the right hybrids? Am I cutting my hay and my silage at the right time? And am I feeding too much starch to hurt fiber digestibility? What does this whole thing look like? And the de novo fatty acids is going to be a really good barometer for that. The other side of that thing in the preformed fatty acids that's where some of that fat's going to go that you're kind of buying. It's like just paying a fee for tax for fats. Like, okay, how much do you want in the butter, fat in the milk? Then you just write a check for some supplement. You might as well just squirt it right in the tank almost, right? So you got the cost on that. Well, that's where it's going to go. But the other thing about that other bucket is it can help you know if cows are losing a lot of body weight. So if you really want to use milk fatty acids to its fullest, you have to go a step more than I think what they did on the small dairies in the Northeast. You have to go to a pen basis on measuring milk fatty acids, because to interpret a cow at 40 days of milk given 100 pounds losing a pound of body weight a day, to interpret her milk fatty acid balance in the milk compared to one that's at 250 days of milk that's gaining a pound a day, those are very different metabolic situations from a fat standpoint. So when you look at the bulk tank, you have something, but if you really want to go to the next level on milk fatty acids, you don't have to do every pen, but you need to do a handful of peaking cows and some mid lactation cows and some cows in a late lactation pen. And then I think you can really build a curve. It's like, are we feeding the cows right? Are they gaining weight? Are they losing weight? Are we feeding too much 18-2? That's what you can find in those late lactation cows. So I'm a big fan of it. And for those of you that are DFA members, I had a client actually tell me, we were talking about this topic of milk fatty acid analysis, and he pulled up his DFA webpage and said, it's on here with it. On every load of milk, we have a milk fatty acid analysis. And I didn't even know. Okay, so every load of milk, I had the milk fatty acid analysis. Now, it was very raw data. There was no averages. There was no goals. It was just a number. So it's getting more and more the milk labs, the common milk labs around the country, either part of a co-op or an independent lab, they're able to run these milk fatty acid analysis. I think we're going to begin to build some data on it. I think we can use the bulk tank numbers as some general guides, but if you really want to dig in deep and really know what's going on and whether we're feeding the cows right, you're going to have to do some string samples.
Yeah, no, that's great, Steve. And it's good to, we got those milk fatty acid analysis came out, a number of years ago, and there's a lot of buzz. And then I haven't heard, being out west, I haven't heard a huge amount of use of that recently. So it's good to hear it's being utilized, and no doubt, as those numbers just become more available, the use of that to be able to say, hey, are we headed in the right direction? Or especially when if we get to where we could be proactively monitoring those things versus just react as, as milk fat starts sliding.
It's
you
not
know,
always just a diet too, right? Because what I
right,
tell people about de
right,
novo fatty acids is that everything you can do that's good for a cow, less crowding, more feeding times per day, better forage quality, better pen conditions, more meals per day, whatever those things are that are good husbandry, they all help de novo fatty acid synthesis. And so
yep,
it's not just about how we build the ration, it's about a lot of management techniques too.
right, absolutely. Yep, awesome. Well, with that, Steve, is there anything else that you want to make sure our audience hears from you about milk fat?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna throw another thank you to Virtus for spurring the industry on in this arena. I think the genetics guys want to take all the credit for, the new normal on butterfat that, Holsteins are giving Jersey milk nowadays. And yeah, they do deserve a lot of credit, but I really do think as the nutritionists are really feeding cows better. And, I think that's been a last 5 to 7 years. The industry has just really learned a lot about this. And, you mentioned a few of the researchers at Michigan State and Penn State in particular that I think have
Right.
also, and Clemson, have also been helping us a long time on how to feed fat better. But yeah, I think think about it just like we do about amino acids and different types of carbohydrates. Sugar is not the same as starch, and palmitic acid isn't the same as linoleic acid. It's not the same as oleic acid. They're different, and we need to do the math on them and make sure we're having the right balance to help the cow the best we can.
Amen to that. All right. Thank you, Steve.
Yes. All right. Hope that was helpful.
Absolutely.